Usually when we talk about measuring the health of the economy, there's this underlying expectation of precision, like it's engineering or something.
Right, like it's a science.
Yeah, exactly. You look at the GDP print or the monthly jobs report or the consumer price index, and it feels like looking at an X-ray.
Well, that's a good way to put it.
Right. It shows that crisp white line, and the economist on television just points at the chart and declares, there it is, the economy is expanding or contracting.
Up or down, black and white.
Yeah, up or down. It feels clean, comforting even, because we like our economic reality to be visible, perfectly categorized in a neat little spreadsheet. But then you step out of the sterile environment of lagging indicators and into the physical world.
Which is never sterile.
Never. You step into the world of physical freight, of supply chains and transportation logistics, and suddenly that crisp X-ray machine is it's completely shattered. We're looking at an economic landscape that is murky, unpredictable, and happening in real time.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, because unlike a jobs report that tells you what happened, 30 days ago, freight is the pulse of what is happening this very second.
Literally right now.
Literally right now. It is happening in the rain on an interstate highway in Ohio, on a loading dock in Texas. It is the actual physical engine of the economy.
Which brings us to our mission today. We've gathered just a fascinating stack of source material to decode this physical engine. We are diving deep into the freight transportation sector using the Q1 2026 earnings call for Knight-Swift Transportation.
Ticker symbol KNX.
Right, KNX, using that as our primary map. And we also have some foundational background intelligence on the structure of the company itself to help us navigate. Now, spending a significant chunk of time parsing through a freight company's earnings call might sound a bit dry if you aren't an industry insider.
Oh, sure. Listening to executives talk about tractor counts and route yields feels like insider baseball.
Total insider baseball. But this isn't just about one company's quarterly profits. For you, the listener, this is a crystal ball.
Absolutely. Because if you want to understand the macroeconomic forces that are going to impact every single consumer in the country over the next 6 to 12 months, you look at freight.
You look at the trucks.
You look at the trucks. If it costs significantly more to move a massive shipment of refrigerators from a manufacturing plant to a big box retail distribution center today, well, the consumer's absolutely going to pay more for that refrigerator tomorrow.
The cost gets passed down.
Exactly. The cost of moving goods is the ultimate leading indicator of inflation, of consumer demand in corporate health. And Knight-Swift is one of the absolute largest players in this space. I mean, they move the goods that make up the daily physical reality of millions of people.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get into the wild, counterintuitive numbers from this specific quarter, we need to set the scene.
Yeah, we need context.
To grasp the scale here, you really have to visualize the footprint. So Knight-Swift was incorporated back in 1989. They are headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona, but their operational scale across the United States and Mexico is it's staggering.
It really is.
We are talking about tens of thousands of tractors, tens of thousands of trailers. They serve retail giants, food and beverage conglomerates, consumer products, housing materials, automotive parts. I mean, basically, if it exists in the physical world and you can buy it, they probably put it on a truck at some point in its life cycle.
The timing of this specific analysis is what makes this source material so compelling right now. The overarching narrative that emerges from these transcripts, when you're listening to CEO Adam Miller, CFO Andrew Hess, and the rest of the executive team, is that the entire American supply chain is witnessing a violent inflection point.
Violent is the right word for it.
Yeah. For over 3 years, dating back to the aftermath of the pandemic boom, the trucking market has been incredibly brutal for carriers. It has been massively oversupplied.
Right. You had a situation with too many trucks chasing not enough freight, which absolutely crushed the pricing power of the established transportation companies.
Crushed it.
Because during that 2021 boom, spot rates were so sky high that everyone with a pulse and a down payment bought a semi-truck.
Yep. The market was completely flooded with capacity.
But according to Knight-Swift's management, the tide is turning rapidly here in early 2026.
It is. And the crucial detail here is that it isn't just turning because of organic, invisible hand economics where demand slowly catches up to supply. It is turning because of a massive, sweeping regulatory crackdown that is physically, forcefully removing thousands of trucks and drivers from the road.
Which is a wild, almost unprecedented dynamic to witness in real time. But before we can fully grasp why Knight-Swift is making millions or losing millions, depending on how you look at the ledger, we really have to understand the physical mechanics of how they actually move goods.
We have to look under the hood.
Right. We need to look at the anatomy of this giant, because they aren't just one monolithic fleet of white trucks driving in straight lines. They operate 4 distinct, heavily intertwined business segments.
And understanding these 4 pillars is non-negotiable if you want to understand the chess game they're playing with the broader economy. A company of this size doesn't just survive by doing one thing well. I mean, they survive by moving freight across different modes depending on the macroeconomic weather.
So let's break them down. The first pillar and the undisputed heavyweight of their operation is the truckload segment. In the industry, they also call this one-way or over the road.
Right.
When you picture a massive semi-truck rolling down Interstate 80, this is what you're picturing. It involves irregular routes, dedicated fleets assigned to specific large customers, refrigerated trailers keeping your supermarket produce cold, and flatbeds carrying steel beams for construction.
Roughly 70% of their physical fleet is deployed in this one-way, over-the-road service. It is the lifeblood, really the core engine of the company. However, as Adam Miller notes in the call, because it is the largest segment, it has also been the most painful place to be over the past 3 years.
Because of that oversupply we mentioned.
Exactly. This segment felt the absolute brunt of that massive influx of new opportunistic trucking companies that flooded the market back in 2021. When supply goes up that much, the price you can charge for a full truckload just plummets.
Right. Then you have the second pillar, which is LTL, which stands for less than truckload. And this is a fundamentally different physical operation. It relies on regional and national networks of terminals to move smaller shipments.
Yes, so with the traditional truckload segment we just discussed, the customer is basically renting the entire 53-foot trailer. It goes from point A to point B, sealed and untouched. But with less than truckload, a manufacturer might only have, say, 3 pallets of goods.
Right, and that's not enough to justify paying for a whole truck.
Exactly. So the LTL carrier picks up those 3 pallets, brings them to a local terminal, unloads them, and consolidates them into a different trailer alongside shipments from like 5 other companies that are all heading in the same general direction. It is a highly complex hub and spoke system.
It's a massive logistical puzzle happening every single night at these terminals, cross-docking freight so the truck runs full. Okay, now, the third pillar is logistics, which essentially acts as a freight brokerage. This is fascinating because it's an asset-light model.
No trucks involved on their end.
Right. In this segment, Knight-Swift manages freight for customers, but they don't necessarily use their own Knight-Swift branded trucks to move it. They use third-party transportation providers.
They act as the intermediary. A shipper comes to them with a load. Knight-Swift goes out to a network of tens of thousands of independent carriers, finds someone to take it for a slightly lower price than the shipper's paying, and pockets the margin.
And finally, the fourth pillar is intermodal. This is where the physical modes of transport collide. It involves combining truck drayage, which is just the industry term for that short-haul trucking segment, with third-party rail services.
Right.
So a Knight-Swift truck picks up a shipping container at a port or a warehouse, drives it 50 miles to a railhead, a massive crane lifts it onto a train, it travels 1,000 miles across the country via rail, and then another Knight-Swift truck picks it up at the destination rail yard to deliver it to the final warehouse.
You know, to really conceptualize why a single company would operate 4 drastically different business models, it helps to look at how consumers experience different types of travel, because the mechanics are remarkably similar.
I love this analogy. It's basically like passenger travel. So think about the truckload segment as chartering a private jet. You buy the entire capacity of the plane. It goes exactly where you dictate, directly from your starting point to your destination without stopping.
Exactly.
The LTL, less than truckload segment, is like buying a single seat on a commercial flight on an airline like Delta or United. You are sharing the plane with 100 other people who are all going to the same general region, and you might have to take a connecting flight through a major hub like Atlanta or Chicago where you switch planes.
And the logistics brokerage, following that logic, operates exactly like a travel agent. You tell the agent where you need to go, and they scour the open market to find a third-party airline to take you, taking a commission for making the arrangement. But you never actually fly on an airplane owned by the travel agent.
Right. And intermodal is like taking an Uber to the Amtrak station, riding the train from New York to Chicago, and then taking another Uber from the station to your hotel. You are seamlessly linking different modes of transit to optimize for cost over speed.
The strategic rationale for building this complex multimodal matrix is to create a massive flywheel effect. It builds a mode of resilience around the company's revenues, because freight demand is incredibly fluid. When the traditional truckload market gets extremely tight and the cost to charter that private jet skyrockets, a major retail shipper might look at their budget and say, "We can't afford these highway rates, but we have a little extra lead time before this product needs to be on the shelves."
So Knight-Swift doesn't lose the customer to a competitor. They just say, no problem, let's shift this volume over to our intermodal rail division.
Exactly. They capture the revenue on a different line item.
Yeah.
Or if Knight-Swift is overwhelmed with freight demand and physically doesn't have enough of their own trucks available to service a customer, well, their logistics division simply brokers that excess freight out to their vetted network of third-party carriers. The customer stays locked entirely within the Knight-Swift ecosystem, completely insulated from the macroeconomic turbulence.
The listener needs to know that the clothes you are wearing right now, the device you are listening to this on, almost certainly traveled through a matrix exactly like this.
Almost guaranteed.
The electronics might have arrived at a West Coast port, traveled via intermodal rail to a massive distribution center in the Midwest, where a dedicated truckload fleet moved it to a regional warehouse, and finally, a localized LTL shipment brought it to the back door of your neighborhood electronics store.
You are interacting with the end result of this complex choreography every time you buy something. But managing this matrix, keeping thousands of moving parts synchronized, is incredibly susceptible to external shocks, which leads us perfectly into the financial reality of the first quarter of 2026.
Because on the surface, the numbers they reported are a massive head-scratcher.
Yeah, they are. If you read the transcript of CEO Adam Miller's opening remarks, his tone is remarkably bullish. He explicitly states there are more reasons to be optimistic about the freight industry right now than they have seen in over 4 years. He paints a picture of a market roaring back to life.
But then you flipped the actual balance sheet to the GAAP earnings, the generally accepted accounting principles bottom line, which is the strictest measure of corporate profitability. And they reported a net loss of 1 cent per share.
A literal loss.
A literal loss. Operating income cratered, dropping by $38 million year over year.
They did highlight an adjusted EPS of 9 cents, which strips out certain one-time costs. But even that was down drastically from 28 cents in the prior year. The raw operating income decline is what caught everyone's attention.
Wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. How can the executive suite be pitching this grand narrative of a massive market turnaround when the immediate hard numbers show them losing money on a GAAP basis? Are they just trying to spin a terrible quarter to keep investors from panicking? I mean, if your operating income drops by nearly $40 million, how do you justify claiming the market is the best it's been in 4 years?
It is the most critical question to ask when looking at these sources. To understand the executive's optimism, we have to dissect that $38 million drop forensically. CFO Andrew Hiss spent a significant portion of the call breaking that loss down into very specific buckets. In financial circles, they refer to this as a kitchen sink quarter.
A kitchen sink quarter, right? Meaning management looks at a quarter that is already going to be weak, and they decide to throw every piece of bad news, every pending legal settlement, every deferred write-off into the numbers all at once to clear the decks. They throw everything but the kitchen sink into the loss column so the next quarter looks pristine.
That is the exact mechanism. So let's look at the anatomy of that $38 million hit, because it reveals why Wall Street largely shrugged off the GAAP loss. First, Hess details an $18 million expense hitting their LTL segment. But this massive expense wasn't the result of failing to move freight efficiently in January, February, or March of 2026. It was an adverse arbitration ruling on a liability claim stemming all the way back to 2022.
So a ghost from 4 years ago, a piece of litigation that had been winding its way through the legal system finally settles, and it takes an $18 million bite out of the current quarter's operating income.
Exactly. It hits the ledger today, but it provides absolutely zero diagnostic information about the current supply and demand dynamics of the freight market.
No.
Then Hess points to a $4 million expense in their truckload segment. This is an adverse decision regarding a tax reimbursement dispute in Mexico, again, for prior tax years.
Another ghost from the past. So if we do the math, that is $22 million of the $38 million drop entirely accounted for by old legal and tax issues that just happened to finalize and hit the books in Q1 of 2026.
Right. And the final major bucket they identify is an estimated $12 to $14 million net negative impact from severe winter weather disruptions in January, combined with sharply rising diesel fuel prices.
Now, that piece is fascinating to me because while lawsuits and taxes are paper ghosts, weather is the visceral, physical reality of the trucking business. I want to spend a minute dissecting this because seeing a number like $12 to $14 million lost just to snow and ice in a single month is staggering to a layperson. How exactly does bad weather cost a trucking company tens of millions of dollars? Like, I get they have to slow down, but $14 million.
Well, it creates a catastrophic cascade effect across the entire network. When severe winter weather hits, particularly when it hits regions like the Southeast that lack the infrastructure to clear roads quickly, the physical movement of goods simply grinds to a halt. The immediate impact is that thousands of trucks are physically stranded at truck stops or on the side of the highway.
And a stranded truck is an incredibly expensive asset just sitting there.
Worse than sitting, it's idling. To keep the driver safe and warm, the engine has to run. Idling burns diesel fuel at an alarming rate. And remember, fuel prices were sharply rising during this exact window. So you have thousands of tractors burning expensive diesel without generating a single cent of revenue because the wheels aren't turning.
Wow. But the bleeding doesn't stop when the snow melts, right? There's a domino effect on the schedule.
Oh, the scheduling disruption is where the real financial damage occurs. The modern supply chain operates on incredibly tight delivery windows, known as dock appointments. If a night Swift driver misses their Tuesday morning unloading slot at a major distribution center because they were stranded in a blizzard, they don't just get to roll up on Wednesday morning and unload. That Wednesday dock schedule is already completely booked with other trucks.
The stranded driver loses their place in line, so what happens? Do they just sit in the parking lot?
Often, yes. The truck might sit for 3 days waiting for a new slot to open up. During those 3 days, the truck is generating zero revenue. The driver is incredibly frustrated because they're often paid by the mile, and the next 3 subsequent shipments that specific driver was scheduled to pick up later in the week have to be canceled or reassigned.
Total nightmare for dispatch.
Yeah, the dispatcher has to scramble to find other trucks to cover the domino of missed loads. The entire network seizes up and efficiency plummets.
And so the $12 to $14 million represents the pure friction of that cascading failure.
Exactly.
In this specific quarter, they noted the weather hit the Southeast and Midwest heavily, regions where Night Swift has massive freight density. But crucially, just like the old lawsuits, winter weather is a temporary anomaly. As Andrew has pointed out, you don't expect January blizzards to reoccur in May.
Right. If you strip out the 2022 arbitration, the Mexico tax dispute, and the January ice storms, the core operational performance of the business looks entirely different. It reveals an underlying strength that the raw GAAP numbers obscure. And to really understand how analysts view that underlying strength, we need to dive into a specific financial metric that dominates this earnings call. If you want to understand the economics of freight, you have to understand the OR, the operating ratio.
Okay, let's break down the OR, because to anyone outside of transportation, it sounds like arcane financial jargon, but it's actually an incredibly intuitive way to look at a business.
It is. The operating ratio is the ultimate pulse check for a transportation company's efficiency. It represents total operating expenses as a percentage of total revenue. So if a company reports an OR of 97%, it means that for every single dollar the company brings in the door, it costs them 97 cents to operate the business. Paying drivers, buying fuel, paying insurance, maintaining the trucks.
Leaving practically nothing.
Right. That leaves just 3 cents of operating profit from that dollar.
And Night Swift's consolidated adjusted OR for the quarter was exactly that, 97%. They were spending 97 cents to make a dollar, which sounds terrifying. You are living on the absolute razor's edge of profitability. One blown tire, one minor accident, and that 3 cents of profit on a load is instantly wiped out, turning into a loss.
It is a painfully tight margin. And they noted it was up 230 basis points year over year, which in plain English just means it worsened by 2.3% compared to last year. But this metric is exactly where CEO Adam Miller provides the crucial context for his extreme optimism.
How so?
Well, he states clearly that in a normalized freight market, what they call a mid-cycle environment where supply and demand are balanced, their truckload business does not operate at a 97 OR. Historically, they operate in the mid-80s.
Let's pause and do the math on that because the implications are massive. Mid-80s, let's say an 85 OR. That means it only costs them 85 cents to make a dollar, leaving 15 cents of pure operating profit. The difference between a 97 OR and an 85 OR is astronomical.
It's huge.
If your profit margin goes from 3 cents on the dollar to 15 cents on the dollar, your profitability doesn't just improve incrementally, it multiplies by a factor of 5. That is a 500% increase in profitability, and you don't even have to add a single new truck to your fleet to achieve it. You just need the market rates to recover.
And this mathematical reality is why Wall Street analysts look past the kitchen sink elements of the quarter. They aren't pricing Knight-Swift stock based on January snowstorms or 4-year-old litigation. They are looking at the underlying structural momentum of the industry. They are looking for signals that the market is finally returning to an environment where an 85 OR is possible. And according to the executives on this call, that structural shift began happening violently at the end of the first quarter.
I love that phrasing, violent shifts, because it sets up the next major chapter of our deep dive perfectly. When February and March rolled around, the weather cleared up. The snow melted. Historically, when severe weather clears, the supply chain unsticks, the stranded trucks get back on the road, and spot prices immediately drop back down as capacity floods back into the market. But that didn't happen this year.
No, it didn't.
The network unfroze, but the market stayed incredibly tight. Prices stayed elevated. Why? Because the supply of available trucks didn't bounce back, it is actively shrinking. We are witnessing a transition from temporary weather-driven market tightness to a permanent regulatory-driven capacity purge.
This purge is the core pillar of Adam Miller's thesis for the industry. To understand why trucks are vanishing from the road today, we have to look back at the historical anomaly of 2021. During the height of the pandemic boom, consumer demand for physical goods was insatiable. Everyone was sitting at home ordering furniture and electronics.
Yeah, the Amazon boxes were piling up.
Exactly. The demand to move freight far exceeded the supply of trucks. Consequently, spot rates, which is the price to move a single load on the open non-contract market, skyrocketed to historic highs.
It created an absolute Wild West scenario in the trucking industry. Anyone with a commercial driver's license, a rudimentary business plan, and enough cash for a down payment could buy a used tractor and practically print money.
The source material repeatedly refers to the influx of what they call chameleon carriers. This is a deeply descriptive industry term. A chameleon carrier is a small, opportunistic operator, often severely undercapitalized. Because they lack the infrastructure of a Knight-Swift, they often survive by cutting corners.
What kind of corners?
Well, they might defer critical maintenance on their brakes, they might purchase the absolute bare minimum liability insurance, or they might push their drivers to violate federal hours of service regulations to run extra miles.
And when they eventually get caught, when a DOT inspector finds the bald tires or a driver causes a major accident and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration comes down on them and revokes their operating authority.
They utilize the chameleon tactic. They simply shut the doors of ABC Trucking on a Friday afternoon. Over the weekend, they paint a brand new DOT operating number on the side of the same truck, register under a spouse's name as XYZ Logistics, and reopen for business on Monday morning. They blend right back into the environment, escaping the penalties and the higher insurance premiums associated with their previous safety violations.
That is insane. The industry was absolutely flooded with these operators who, as Adam Miller very diplomatically phrased it on the call, may not have been playing by the rules that we play by.
Very diplomatic.
Right. And the economic impact of this is profound. If you are a chameleon carrier and you don't pay for top-tier insurance, you don't maintain a terminal network, and you exploit inexperienced drivers, your operating costs are artificially dangerously low.
Which allows these bad actors to undercut the compliant, safe carriers on price. They drove the spot market rates into the ground, pulling contract rates down with them, and plunged the entire freight industry into a multi-year slump. It was a race to the bottom, fueled by non-compliance.
But the sources indicate that the party is officially over. The transcripts detail a multi-pronged, highly aggressive crackdown currently being executed by the FMCSA and the Department of Transportation. And this isn't just bureaucratic posturing or proposed legislation. It is happening physically right now in the early months of 2026, and it is actively forcing thousands of trucks off the highway. We need to walk through the specific mechanisms of what the government is doing.
The regulatory dragnet is extensive. The first major mechanism is the aggressive identification and revocation of improperly issued non-domiciled commercial driver's licenses, or CDLs.
Let's explain how the CDL loophole actually works, because it's a massive blind spot in highway safety.
Yeah, the loophole allowed individuals to bypass strict state-level testing. An individual residing in a state with rigorous CDL testing requirements, say New York or California, would essentially rent an address or use a shell company in a state known for extremely lax testing standards.
Wow.
Yeah, they would obtain a non-domiciled CDL from that lax state without ever actually living there, bypassing the rigorous safety vetting required by their true home state. The DOT is now cross-referencing databases, finding these fraudulently obtained licenses, and invalidating them. Instantly, that driver can no longer legally operate a truck.
And hand in hand with revoking the licenses, the government is systematically shutting down non-compliant CDL training schools. And we aren't talking about legitimate trade schools here. The industry had developed a shadow economy of schools that were essentially diploma mills for commercial drivers.
Right. A federal requirement dictates that a new driver must complete a specific number of behind-the-wheel training hours before taking the CDL exam. These shadow schools would take a fee, put the student in a truck for perhaps a tenth of the required hours, and then self-certify to the federal government that the student had completed the full curriculum.
It's terrifying.
They were churning out commercial drivers who fundamentally did not know how to safely handle an 80,000-pound vehicle in traffic. The FMCSA is now auditing these schools, shutting them down, and in some cases, invalidating the CDLs of the drivers who graduated from them.
The sources also note the government is stepping up strict enforcement of English language proficiency requirements for commercial drivers. This isn't a minor administrative rule, it's a massive safety issue. If a driver cannot communicate with a dispatcher regarding a hazardous materials spill, cannot read complex road signs regarding weight limits on bridges, or cannot interact effectively with law enforcement at a way station, they are a hazard.
Beyond the immediate enforcement actions, there are massive legislative pushes looming in the background. The call references initiatives like Lila's Law, which aims to dramatically tighten the enforcement mechanisms around carrier safety ratings. But the most terrifying proposal for these marginal carriers is the push to increase the federal minimum insurance requirement for motor carriers from $750,000 to $5 million.
A $5 million commercial liability minimum is an absolute kill shot for the chameleon carriers. If you are a shady operator running two poorly maintained trucks on a shoestring budget, relying on bare bones insurance, you simply cannot absorb the premium hike for a $5 million policy. The math stops working. You are priced out of the game instantly. But of all the regulatory elements discussed on this earnings call, there is one data point that made me completely stop what I was doing.
I think I know which one you're talking about.
It involves the mechanics of drug testing truck drivers.
The hair follicle testing discrepancy. Yes, this is perhaps the most glaring example of the dangerous friction between slow-moving federal bureaucracy and actual on-the-ground safety standards.
Let me lay out the mechanics of this, because it is legitimately terrifying for anyone who drives on an interstate. The federal government, through the DOT, mandates that commercial truck drivers must undergo urinalysis for drug testing. That is the legal baseline. If you pass the urine test, you're placed in the federal clearinghouse as a clean driver. But Knight-Swift voluntarily decides that urinalysis isn't good enough. They pay extra out of their own corporate pocket to conduct hair follicle testing on every single one of their applicants, and the results are shocking. According to Treasurer Brad Stewart on the call, the hair follicle test identifies roughly 14 times more drug users than the federally mandated urine test. 14 times.
The biological reality of the testing methods explains the massive discrepancy. Urinalysis, the federal standard, only detects drug use within a very short recent window, often just a few days. If a habitual drug user abstains for 72 hours, they will likely pass the urine test. Hair follicle testing, however, traps the chemical markers of drugs in the hair shaft as it grows.
Right.
It can detect habitual long-term use over a window of several months. So Knight-Swift is utilizing a vastly superior diagnostic tool, catching 14 times as many users, and rightfully refusing to hire them.
I picture it like fishing. The federal government tells every trucking company you only have to fish for drug users using a single piece of string and a rusty hook. Knight-Swift looks at that and says, no, we are going to fish using a high-tech, deep-water sonar net. Obviously, the sonar net catches exponentially more fish, but here is the absolute kicker, the thing that is driving the executives crazy. The government only counts the fish caught on the string.
That is the source of the immense, palpable frustration expressed by Brad Stewart and Adam Miller. Congress actually recognized this flaw years ago. They passed legislation authorizing the use of hair follicle testing results for the Federal Driver Clearinghouse. But the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, has simply never gotten around to writing the actual bureaucratic rules required to implement the law into practice.
Unbelievable.
The law exists, but the mechanism to enforce it doesn't.
So walk me through what actually happens to that applicant. Knight-Swift pays for the hair test. The applicant fails spectacularly, showing months of heavy drug use. Knight-Swift tells the applicant, "We aren't hiring you, you are a danger to society." But because HHS hasn't written the rules, Knight-Swift is legally prohibited from reporting that positive hair test result to the Federal Clearinghouse.
That is the terrifying reality.
Yeah.
That driver, who Knight-Swift knows factually and scientifically is a habitual drug user, simply walks out the door of the Knight-Swift recruiting office. They drive down the street to a lower-tier marginal carrier, perhaps one of those chameleon carriers we discussed, that only performs the bare minimum federal urine test.
Wow.
Because the driver abstained for a few days, they pass the urine test. The lower-tier carrier checks the Federal Clearinghouse, sees a clean record because Knight-Swift couldn't report the hair test, and hires them.
And the next day, that driver is out on the highway piloting an 80,000-pound missile at 70 miles per hour right next to your family minivan. When you think about it, this entire deep dive into operating ratios and earnings per share, it ultimately boils down to the physical reality of who you are sharing the highway with. This isn't just an abstract discussion about corporate profitability for Knight-Swift. It is fundamentally a conversation about life or death highway safety.
It absolutely is. And what Adam Miller's pointing out to Wall Street is that the current regulatory administration is finally waking up and cracking down. Even without the hair follicle rule being finalized by HHS, the intense pressure on CDL fraud, the crackdown on fake training schools, and the looming insurance hikes are collectively acting as a massive broom, sweeping the worst actors out of the market.
Which creates a profound macroeconomic shift. Because when the government effectively sweeps a significant percentage of trucking capacity out of the market, the overall supply of available trucks shrinks dramatically. Meanwhile, consumer demand for goods is holding steady or even slightly improving as inflation cools. The underlying math of economics is inescapable. What happens when supply shrinks rapidly while demand stays the same?
Prices explode. And the pricing power in the freight industry shifts violently from the shippers who manufacture the goods back to the carriers who transport them. This dynamic brings us to the most fiercely contested battleground in the logistics world: bid season.
Bid season is a fascinating corporate ritual. It typically happens early in the year. Large shippers, think major big box retailers, national grocers, massive consumer packaged goods manufacturers, put their entire freight network out to bid. They want to lock in contractual rates for the next 12 months to stabilize their supply chain budgets. They essentially say to the market, "I have 500 loads a week going from Dallas to Chicago for the entire year. Which carrier will give me the best guaranteed price to secure that capacity?"
The tone in this earnings call regarding the current bid season is one of pure, unadulterated confidence from Knight-Swift. The speed at which the market has turned is remarkable. Listen to the timeline Adam Miller lays out. Just 1 quarter ago, at the end of 2025, Knight-Swift's management was going into these bid negotiations playing defense. They were hoping to secure low to mid single-digit percentage rate increases just to cover inflation. But now, in the first quarter of 2026, their posture has completely inverted.
Totally inverted.
They are walking into those same rooms, targeting high single to low double-digit rate increases. That is a massive, aggressive jump in pricing expectations in a span of just 90 days.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And the craziest part is they're actually getting it. Miller noted that they aren't even waiting for contracts to expire. They are reviewing business that isn't currently up for bid, looking at contracts they signed 6 months ago, going to the customers whose rates are now deemed below market, and demanding immediate mid-cycle price adjustments. And the shippers are swallowing the pill and agreeing to pay more. Why? Because the alternative is terrifying for a logistics manager. The alternative is going to the spot market, where prices are rocketing past contract rates.
The terminology the executives use on this call exposes the sheer panic starting to bubble up within the shipping community. The sources frequently mention 2 specific phenomena happening right now in the market: turnback bids and mini bids. Defining these terms is crucial because they are the ultimate proof of how fast the ground is shifting beneath the shipper's feet.
Let's explore the mechanics of a turnback bid, because it sounds like a carrier simply reneging on a deal.
Essentially, yes, but it's a standard mechanism in a volatile market. Let's say a month ago, Carrier A wins a contract to move a shipper's freight from Atlanta to Miami at a rate of $2 a mile. They sign the paper. Over the next 30 days, the regulatory crackdown intensifies, marginal carriers go bankrupt, and trucks leave the market. Suddenly, the going rate on the open spot market for that exact same lane jumps to $2.40 a mile. Carrier A looks at their contract for $2, calls the shipper, and simply rejects the freight. They turn it back. They say, "I'm sorry, I cannot and will not service this freight at the rate we agreed to last month because the open market is paying 40 cents more per mile."
So the carrier just walks away. They deploy their trucks to the more lucrative spot market, leaving the shipper holding the bag, staring at pallets of freight sitting on a loading dock with no truck coming to pick it up, which leads directly to the second phenomenon, the mini bid.
Right. The shipper is now in crisis mode. They have stranded freight. Their carefully constructed routing guide, which is essentially a prioritized list of contracted carriers they call in order, has completely disintegrated because every carrier on the list keeps rejecting the loads at the old prices. So the shipper is forced to issue a mini bid. This is a frantic off-cycle emergency auction pushed out to the market just to secure immediate capacity to keep their supply chain moving.
And Adam Miller specifically points out a crucial psychological shift happening within these mini bids. He says that over the past 3 years, shippers would occasionally issue mini bids opportunistically, trying to sniff out even deeper discounts from desperate carriers. But today, they are issuing them out of pure, unadulterated need. They just need a truck to show up. There is a specific quote from the transcripts that highlights just how deep this panic goes. The executives note that major shippers are already initiating discussions with Knight-Swift about securing capacity for peak season.
Peak season being the massive surge in freight volume in Q3 and Q4 leading up to the holidays.
Yes. Why are logistics managers at massive retailers suddenly begging for peak season capacity guarantees in the first quarter of the year? That's the equivalent of buying your Thanksgiving turkey in April. It makes no sense unless they are terrified of what November will look like.
It reveals the deep, lingering psychological scarring from the 2021 supply chain crisis. The people running logistics at these massive retailers remember exactly what happened when capacity vanished overnight. They remember the empty store shelves, the delayed product launches, the lost revenue. For 3 years, those same shippers held all the cards. They relentlessly beat carriers down on price during negotiations because trucks were plentiful. But now, they're watching the spot rates rocket upward. They see the deep discounts evaporating.
I see the writing on the wall.
They do. They are doing the math. They realize that if they don't lock in premium asset-based carriers like Knight-Swift right now, even if it means paying a double-digit rate increase today, they will be left entirely stranded at the altar in November when the holiday freight volume hits.
They are essentially paying a premium today as an insurance policy against a Q4 catastrophe. And the sources specifically highlight that shippers are drastically changing who they want to do business with. They are highly favoring asset-based relationships over pure brokers right now. When the market is tight, a shipper wants to sign a contract with a company like Knight-Swift that physically owns the 40,000 trailers and employs the drivers. They want the certainty of steel and rubber, rather than relying on a pure broker who just promises to try and find a truck on the open market.
Which serves as a perfect transition to look at how this tectonic shift in the industry is forcing evolution far beyond the highway. The core truckload segment is feeling the heat and driving the rate increases, but the rippling effects of this chaotic market are fundamentally altering how Knight-Swift operates its other divisions, particularly logistics and the LTL segment.
Let's focus on the logistics division, their brokerage arm, because this is where the consequences of those chameleon carriers we discussed earlier really come home to roost in a terrifying way. I was reading through the operational metrics for the logistics segment, and one statistic jumped off the page. It's almost unbelievable. Knight-Swift's logistics division aggressively, intentionally cut the number of third-party carriers they use in their network by 30% since the start of the year. 30%.
It is a stunning, self-inflicted purge of their own supply chain capacity. Remember the business model. A logistics division makes money by matching shippers with third-party carriers. The more carriers you have in your digital network, the easier it is to cover a load and collect a margin. To willingly excommunicate nearly a third of your entire capacity network in a single quarter is a drastic, incredibly painful maneuver.
Why on earth would a brokerage willingly kneecap its own supply? I mean, if you cut 30% of your carriers, you can't move as much freight.
They did it for 2 reasons, both tied to the darker criminal side of the freight industry right now. The explosion of organized cargo theft and shady carrier practices like double brokering.
Let's talk about the mechanics of cargo theft, because I think the average person pictures something out of a movie. Someone with bolt cutters swiping a television off the back of a parked truck at a dark rest stop. But what Knight-Swift is fighting isn't petty theft. It is highly sophisticated, organized digital crime.
The industry has seen a massive, highly organized surge in digital identity theft. Criminal rings have learned how to exploit the anonymity of digital freight load boards. Here's how it works. A criminal syndicate identifies a legitimate trucking company. They steal their DOT number and their digital identity. They log onto a load board, acting as that legitimate carrier, and book a highly lucrative load from a broker like Knight-Swift, say, an entire trailer full of expensive copper wire or pharmaceuticals.
They're impersonating a real trucking company.
Exactly. Then they take that load and double broker it. They turn around and hire a completely different, unsuspecting, legitimate carrier to actually go pick up the copper wire. The legitimate driver picks it up and delivers it. The broker pays the criminal syndicate, thinking they're the carrier. The criminal syndicate pockets the money and vanishes, leaving the actual driver completely unpaid.
That is wild.
Or, in the worst case scenario, the criminal syndicate hires a complicit driver, they pick up the copper wire, redirect the truck to a shadow warehouse, unload the freight, and the entire shipment disappears forever. The broker Knight-Swift Logistics is left holding the massive liability for the stolen freight and facing a furious customer.
So how is Knight-Swift fighting back against this digital syndicate? Because they are actively sacrificing short-term revenue to build this defense. The sources show their logistics volume was down 18.9% in the quarter, and revenue was down almost 10%, largely because they rejected so many loads that were deemed unprofitable under their strict new rules. What are these rules?
They implemented what Treasurer Brad Stewart called already rigorous carrier qualification standards, and then enhanced them to a forensic level. They were no longer just checking if a DOT number is active. They're looking at how long a carrier has been in continuous operation to weed out the weekend pop-up chameleon carriers. They are demanding real-time evidence from electronic logging devices, or ELDs, so Knight-Swift can verify exactly where a tractor is geographically via GPS before giving them a load.
And crucially, Adam Miller pointed out the biggest, most dangerous blind spot in the entire brokerage industry. Usually, the broker sitting in an office in Phoenix has absolutely no idea who the human being is that is physically sitting behind the steering wheel in Chicago. You hire the corporate entity, ABC Trucking, but who is the person driving?
To solve that, Knight-Swift is now requiring actual copies of the driver's license. They are forcing the carrier to verify the physical identity of the person in the cab, particularly if that driver is hauling a trailer owned by Knight-Swift in a power-only arrangement. They are building a digital and physical fortress around their customers' freight.
It is incredible operational discipline. They're looking at the market and saying, we would rather lose money today by shrinking our volume and taking a 10% revenue hit than expose our customers to the risk of organized fraud. The long-term strategic play here is obvious. By building this premium, ultra-secure, fraud-free network of vetted carriers, they are creating a bespoke product. When the chaos and theft of the open spot market become too risky for major shippers, those shippers will happily pay Knight-Swift a massive premium for the guarantee of security.
It is a calculated sacrifice of short-term volume for long-term margin expansion and brand trust. And while the logistics division is shrinking to grow stronger, the LTL less-than-truckload division is undergoing a massive physical and structural evolution of its own.
Let's pivot to that LTL segment. We spent time earlier discussing that $18 million legal ghost from 2022 that completely dragged down the LTL segment's operating ratio on paper. But if you look beneath that single anomalous line item, the underlying physical metrics of the LTL business are absolutely booming. The physical mix of the freight they are moving is changing fundamentally.
The operational statistics Andrew has provided are highly indicative of a massive, successful strategic pivot. Weight per shipment increased by 5.2% year over year. Length of haul increased by 8.5%, and the overall tonnage trends accelerated continuously throughout the quarter, ending March up almost 7%.
Let's break down the mechanics of why weight per shipment and length of haul are such crucial metrics. Because to a layperson outside the industry, hearing that a pallet is 5.2% heavier doesn't sound like a revolutionary business achievement. But in the physics of an LTL network, it changes everything.
It is the ultimate lever for operating efficiency. In a hub-and-spoke LTL network, your biggest fixed costs are the physical terminal network, the buildings where freight is sorted, and the driver's time spent making a stop. Let's look at the math. If a driver stops at a manufacturing facility to pick up a single pallet that weighs 500 pounds, it takes a certain amount of time to back to the dock, load it, process the paperwork, and drive away. If that same driver stops at the exact same facility, but picks up 2 pallets weighing 1,000 pounds, the administrative cost and the time spent at the dock are almost identical. The physical truck burns roughly the same amount of fuel, but the revenue generated from that single stop just doubled because the freight is heavier.
So a 5.2% increase in weight per shipment distributed across millions of shipments is pure unadulterated margin expansion. The trucks are running denser, the terminals are processing more revenue-generating weight for the same fixed labor cost, and the length of haul going up 8.5% is equally massive.
Adam Miller explicitly stated what this shift in length of haul signifies. Knight-Swift is actively transitioning its LTL footprint from a series of regional networks to a true cohesive national network. They are bringing on more massive industrial customers who require long-haul heavy freight moving across the country rather than just moving light retail consumer goods between neighboring states.
I picture it this way. The old regional LTL model is like a business delivering a few local pizzas on a moped. It keeps you busy, but the revenue ceiling is low. The new national model they're building is like handling massive interstate catering orders in a specialized refrigerated van. The local pizza delivery is fine, but the interstate catering is where the massive margins live. They are leveraging the huge terminal network they've acquired over the years to handle bigger, heavier, longer freight. They are metamorphosing into a national LTL powerhouse.
And managing that transition requires intense operational discipline, which they seem to be executing on, noting specific improvements in variable wage per shipment and dock efficiency. But consider the broader picture. As Knight-Swift successfully pushes rates up across all these divisions, truckload, LTL, intermodal, and as the freight volumes start flowing back into their network, a new, massive physical bottleneck emerges.
And this bottleneck brings us to the final, perhaps most critical chapter of our analysis, the looming war for drivers. Because the physical reality of the transportation business is inescapable. You can have all the high-paying freight contracts in the world, you can have the most advanced AI routing software, you can have a massive terminal network, but if you don't have a human being sitting in the cab holding the steering wheel, the truck does not move. The revenue is zero.
Adam Miller phrased the eternal dilemma of trucking perfectly on the call. He said, "In our industry, you either have drivers or you have loads. Rarely do you have both."
It's a constant, agonizing seesaw. For the last 3 years, carriers had an abundance of drivers sitting around waiting for loads that didn't exist. Now, the seesaw is tipping violently toward having an abundance of loads with no one to drive them. To understand how Knight-Swift is preparing its arsenal for this impending labor war, we have to examine a major corporate acquisition they made recently, U.S. Express.
The acquisition and subsequent integration of U.S. Express is a fascinating case study in brutal, necessary operational turnaround. When Knight-Swift bought them, it was widely known that U.S. Express was struggling mightily. Their operational cost structure was bloated, their safety metrics were lagging the industry standard, and crucially, their freight mix was highly unstable and unprofitable.
Let's look at that freight mix, because Adam Miller noted a staggering statistic. At the time of the acquisition, an unbelievable 40% of U.S. Express's loads were coming from third-party brokers. 40%. If you are a massive asset-based carrier relying on brokers for almost half of your business, you have absolutely no direct relationship with the actual manufacturer or shipper. You are at the absolute mercy of the spot market's volatility. You are essentially taking whatever low-paying scraps the brokers decide to throw your way.
It is fundamentally not a sustainable business model for a carrier with thousands of expensive tractors. So Knight-Swift stepped in and initiated a painful but necessary restructuring. They aggressively shed thousands of unprofitable tractors from the U.S. Express fleet. They intentionally, deliberately shrank the physical size of the business to save its profit margins.
And an analyst on the earnings call actually challenged this strategy. They asked Miller, hey, you shed a few thousand tractors over the last year. Now that the market is finally turning upward and rates are rising, doesn't that hold back your upside? Don't you wish you had kept those trucks around to capture these new high rates?
Miller's defense of the decision was resolute and illuminating. He explained that you don't acquire a struggling company just to hold on to its bloated, unprofitable capacity and hope the market bails you out. They had to go in with a scalpel, strip away the highly volatile brokered freight, and force the sales team to secure direct relationship loads with major shippers. But more importantly than fixing the freight mix, they had to completely overhaul the human element. They completely rewrote the hiring standards at U.S. Express to prioritize safety and quality over sheer driver volume.
And this overhaul leads directly to what we can call the safety dividend. CFO Andrew Hess brought up a metric that proves the turnaround is actually working on the ground. He cited the CSA Crash Basic, which stands for Compliance, Safety, Accountability. It's the federal tracking system that monitors a motor carrier's crash rate and overall safety performance. The CSA Crash Basic at U.S. Express is now 60% better than it was at the exact moment Knight-Swift acquired them, a 60% reduction in negative crash metrics.
That is not just a moral victory for highway safety, though it certainly is that. It is a massive structural financial victory. In the commercial trucking industry, insurance premiums and liability payouts for accidents are exorbitant, margin-crushing expenses. When you improve your crash rate by 60%, your insurance premiums plummet, your equipment damage costs evaporate, your legal liabilities shrink. The margins improve structurally, independent of what the freight rates are doing. As a direct result of these sweeping changes, shedding the bad freight, improving the safety, U.S. Express is now trailing the incredibly efficient legacy Knight-Swift brands by only 300 basis points in operating ratio. They have nearly closed the efficiency gap.
It's a masterclass in corporate restructuring. But returning to the broader war for drivers, as these regulatory crackdowns we discussed earlier forcefully push the unsafe, drug-using, poorly trained drivers entirely out of the industry, the overall pool of available labor shrinks. So the ultimate question becomes, how does Knight-Swift compete for the remaining safe, high-quality drivers when every other carrier in the country is desperate to hire them?
They're aggressively building what you might call a labor moat. They aren't just passively relying on truck stop job boards. They are intensifying their digital marketing spend to target drivers. They are utilizing advanced artificial intelligence to ensure an instant automated response to any incoming driver lead. They want to capture the applicant's attention the second they express interest, before a competing carrier can even pick up the phone.
Because if a driver is sitting in the cab at a truck stop, scrolling on their phone, and applies for a job, they want a response in 3 seconds, not 3 days. But beyond the digital marketing, their ultimate weapon, their true, unassailable competitive advantage, is their proprietary network of driving academies.
This is where their strategy brilliantly circumvents the broader market chaos. If we connect this to the bigger picture we've been painting, the federal government is actively shutting down the non-compliant, shady CDL training schools across the country. The pipeline of cheap, poorly trained labor is being choked off at the source. The pool of drivers is shrinking. So what does Knight-Swift do? They look at the shrinking pool and say, fine, we won't fight over the remaining drivers. We will simply manufacture our own.
By relying heavily on their own intensive training academies across all their brands, Swift, Knight, and now bringing that exact same capability to the U.S. Express terminals, they bypass the tainted pool of drivers entirely. They take raw recruits who have never driven a truck. They train them from day one to Knight-Swift's own exacting safety standards. They run the rigorous hair follicle tests to ensure a clean, drug-free lifestyle. And once the recruit passes, they immediately transition them into their own fleet, often locked in by a contract that repays the cost of the schooling.
It creates a self-sustaining ecosystem of safe, compliant labor. It is an incredible structural advantage. While other carriers are panicking about where to find drivers to handle the rising freight volumes in the back half of the year, Knight-Swift is simply running more classes through their own academies.
So after dissecting the JAP losses, the weather anomalies, the regulatory crackdowns, the shipper panic, and the war for drivers, what does this all mean? Let's bring this all together for you, the listener, who just spent the last hour wading deep into the complex mechanics of freight economics. The massive overarching takeaway from this entire stack of source material is that the great freight recession of the past 3 years is officially, finally ending.
It is ending. But the critical nuance is that it is not ending simply because of natural cyclical economic recovery. It is ending because a coordinated, forceful regulatory cleanup is sweeping the bad actors, the chameleon carriers, and the unsafe drivers off the highway.
And as that artificially cheap, unsafe supply vanishes from the market, massive asset-backed giants like Knight-Swift companies with pristine safety records, proprietary training academies, and the operational discipline to willingly cut 30% of their broker network to stop cargo theft are put squarely back in the power position. They are poised to command double-digit rate increases from shippers who are terrified of being left without capacity. That highly profitable mid-80s operating ratio is clearly visibly in their sights.
This raises an important question. Stepping back from Knight-Swift's specific profitability, synthesizing all this data raises a much larger, frankly unsettling question. One that extends far beyond the boardroom of a transportation company and touches the core of how our society functions. If a multi-billion-dollar cornerstone of the American supply chain, the physical movement of the food we eat and the goods we buy, requires intense, heavy-handed government intervention just to function properly, if it requires DOT crackdowns, shutting down fraudulent schools, cross-referencing databases, and begging for unenforced hair follicle testing rules just to sweep out fraudulent operators and stabilize basic market prices, what does that say about the extreme inherent fragility of our physical economy?
Oh, wow. When you frame it like that, the entire system sounds like it's perpetually balancing on the edge of a knife.
Are we constantly just one wave of deregulation away from the supply chain eating itself alive? From returning to a chaotic Wild West where highway safety is ruthlessly compromised to save pennies on the mile?
That is a deeply chilling thought to end on. We started this deep dive talking about how freight is the murky, muddy X-ray of the economy. It turns out, beneath the surface of the things we buy every single day, the physical machinery delivering them is far more fragile, far more complex, and far more fiercely contested than we ever realize when we click Add to Cart. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking beneath the surface.